Docker containers changed how engineers think about building software, and the company most responsible for the widespread adoption of containers is Docker itself. It is not only an open source project, but it is a company. Since containerization has caught on in the mainstream, companies like RedHat, Google, Huawei, and many other big players have built platform products that utilize Docker containers. Docker containers are the unit that many engineers are using to deploy their applications, but the servers that run those containers are usually on infrastructure providers like Amazon, Google, or Rackspace. This raises the question, how will Docker, the company, make money? They've raised around $180 million in equity, so they have plenty of time to find something that works, and I'm sure they will. But there are suspicions in the open source community that the aggressive changes to the open source Docker project are being made by Docker, the company, with the long-term objective of monetization. These changes, specifically we're talking about this default support for Docker Swarm, and we'll discuss this much more in this episode if you have no idea what I'm talking about. These changes are not directly nefarious, but they are changes that might be less likely to occur if Docker were just an open source project, as opposed to an open source project being tended by a well-financed company. The New Stack is a news outlet that broke this story about the potential Docker fork, and Alex Williams and Joab Jackson of the New Stack join me on today's episode. They have been following this story closely, and we go deep into the facts and the speculations about why a fork might occur, the motivations of different key players like Google and Huawei. And we also talk about the disputes within the community that have led us to this moment. This episode is somewhat of a news type of episode, or like, maybe framed as less of a show about, how are you actually doing your engineering. It's more about, open source governance, open source communities. I think these are very relevant topics to software engineering. And I realize this topic is somewhat salacious. It's somewhat controversial. So if you have any feedback on it, if you think I got anything wrong in my discussion, or if the guys from the New Stack perhaps got anything wrong, please let me know. I would love to know. I would love to be proven wrong. And I would love to have continued discussions about this Docker fork and what might arise as a result of it. So thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy this episode. Please give me any feedback, and please share it if you enjoy it, or share any other episode you like with your friends. Thanks for listening. The Insight Data Engineering program helps software engineers level up their careers. Data engineering is at the cutting edge of how we build software, and it involves some of the most interesting open source and distributed technologies, such as Apache Spark, Kafka, and NoSQL databases. Insight Data Engineering is free because they partner with top companies like Facebook, Uber, Capital One, and Slack. You can learn about data engineering at Insight Data Engineering. And if you go to insightdataengineering.com/sedaily, you can apply. Listeners of this show will be advanced straight to the coding challenge of the application process. If you get accepted, you get to learn how to build useful products in a self-directed program. There are workspaces in New York and Palo Alto that you can utilize during the short 7-week data engineering training process, and you have access to free cloud computing resources and a network of over 600 data engineers and data scientists from over 100 companies. Apply now at insightdataengineering.com/sedaily. Skip straight to the coding challenge. This is a special offer for Software Engineering Daily listeners. Thanks to Insight Data Engineering. And if you want to level up your career, if you want to learn some new skills and change what you are working on in your work environment, and perhaps get a job upgrade if you're looking for a different type of job, or if you're between academia and your career path and you want to build a little more skill before you jump on that career path, learn about data engineering at insightdataengineering.com. Go to insightdataengineering.com/SE-daily to apply and skip straight to that coding challenge. And thanks again to Insight Data Engineering for being a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. You can also check out the interview I did with Insight Data Engineering several months ago on Software Engineering Daily. Let's get back to this episode. Alex Williams and Joab Jackson are writers for The New Stack. Alex and Joab, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So I would like to get into a conversation about Docker and the Docker fork eventually, but first I would like to start by talking just a little bit about The New Stack so listeners have some context for who you are. Alex, why don't you explain what the goals of The New Stack are?
Well, The New Stack focuses on application development and management at scale, and our focus is really on explanation analysis. So we follow the news cycle, but we're not beholden to it. We believe that these are times where the technology development is quite rich and the choices are tremendous, and the technologies are often not explained or really looked at objectively to help people understand what they're all about. And so we really feel that's our job, really, is to help people better understand these technologies and how they're used. And the blog is really primarily for developers and people who manage applications at scale.
Yeah, and what I like about The New Stack is that it fits right under the purview of the type of journalism that I like. Like, I don't care much about politics. I don't care about sports. Right now, the exciting stuff, as far as I'm concerned, is technology. And The New Stack writes about software engineering, software architecture. Is exactly the stuff that I spend my time thinking about. And The New Stack writes about it in a way that is entertaining. I don't read any sports writers, but I imagine if I did, those sports writers would be writing about sports probably in a similar way to how The New Stack writes about containers or orchestration layers or cloud service providers. And I like that. I like that it's both entertaining and very informative. So The New Stack was founded, like you said, to write about these new technologies, these new infrastructures, and you have risen in prominence as a news and information source in parallel with the rise of Docker. And today I do want to talk about Docker with both of you. So why don't you give me the journalist's perspective for how you have seen the Docker ecosystem unfold? Maybe talk about, like, prior to this fork stuff that we're going to be talking about, how have you seen the Docker system unfold, and how has it impacted the area that The New Stack writes about?
Well, when we started The New Stack, it really became evident right from the start that Docker would be a big part of our coverage and who we are. And that just, I think, was apparent in how popular the movement really became, really since its start. And I think one of the first posts I wrote was about the symbolism of Docker. And I think that's probably what's most significant and really what has helped us, define what this new world's all about. The factors that that attribute to why Docker is popular come from the increased demand for applications, the amounts of data that are available for that people are trying to manage, the ability to use cloud services. There's all these factors, and then you have the whole technology stack itself changing quite rapidly. And Docker became really a symbol of that. And what's become apparent over time is that Docker initially served as something quite symbolic for the developer community, but it also has proven to have real significance for people in operations. And Docker, to me, seems like a real symbol of application development and management scale, and as a kind of as a sort of a common environment for helping that DevOps movement, so to speak, really materialize, because there is this, interest in Docker and containers from both, the developer perspective and the operations perspective, but increasingly that, that individual who thinks of themselves as both that developer and a person who understands more about operations than ever before. And so that's really opened up quite a landscape for what we can cover. And so we can cover, increasingly we can cover, the tools for application development and management at scale. We can cover the infrastructure technologies, and I think it'll help us extend ourselves into covering, the data streaming world and, all the new worlds that are coming on with the ability to use data more effectively and layering them into your applications.
Yeah. What's the current business model of Docker, the company?
I don't know, Job.
Yeah, I'm not really so sure myself. I know that I know there are a number of business plans around offering a container registry as well as a hosted containers as a service. In terms of the overall business strategy, I'm not really so sure, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think if you look at it from who they partner with, they have major partnerships with Azure. They have a partnership with AWS, and they have a partnership with HPE, and that I think serves as a foundation for reaching into, I would expect, that enterprise developer community.
I see.
Yeah, so that's I think part of it. I think also they're trying to be a provider that offers containers as a service, and they are I think that they really seem to be focusing on that as their standalone service that they provide.
Now, do you have any? I mean, I'm guessing since you aren't sure about the business model, and I'll say that makes three of us, by the way. Do you have any perspective on, are customers buying what Docker offers?
I think first of all, we have to understand that Docker is 3 years old.
Yeah,
and they developed a great way to kind of package applications, right? I mean, the application delivery, and that has become such a movement, but it's still quite unproven in terms of how it can be actually used in production. We are starting to see proof that containers are being used in production, but in many different contexts. So we see it with, for example, in an orchestration environment. So we're starting to see containers in production, using Kubernetes, for example. We're starting to see some examples of Docker being used, by large, companies. I think it's ADP, and it was one of the companies on stage at DockerCon saying that they're using it. And so I think that's really the big question is, who is using it and how they're using it, and what is the breadth and depth of that client base?
Yeah, well, the challenge, as it seems to me, and this is where we will slowly get into the discussion of the fork, is that we've had examples in the past of companies that are based off of open source projects, like companies like RedHat or Cloudera, and to me, Docker seems slightly different because you take the Red Hat model or the Cloudera model of offering support in conjunction with an open source service. That's kind of the classic open source business model. And that business model doesn't really seem to work in the case of Docker because it seems like the money is in the, maybe there's money in the container layer, but it seems like there's more money in the container orchestration layer. And that's really where we get into what people are bickering about with Docker layering in support for their own orchestration layer in the open source command line tool. And that's kind of what has people concerned is like, is the layering in of the Swarm tool, is that about functionality and utility, or is it more about getting people onboarded with a default orchestration layer of Swarm and then upselling them? I mean, does that sound accurate? Is that an accurate depiction of the frictions between Docker's project and the business viability?
I mean, certainly if you're going to include orchestration capabilities, a fair amount of, I would imagine, Docker's business plan would be around support, and orchestration is just another component that would need to be supported at the enterprise level. So yeah, I mean, I would see that. Of course, Docker wants to present the whole ecosystem to the enterprise as a single kind of integrated offering, and enterprises tend to like that as well. So that plays in. That would play into the business strategy, no doubt. But I think when we get to the fork, I mean, I think there's other reasons. Potential fork. I'm sorry. I think there's other reasons behind that. But yeah, sure. Increasing complexity is always a good. It always is a good way of generating support business.
Alex, does my depiction sound accurate?
Yeah, I think the question about Docker really is it a component or is it a product? And Docker wants to treat it as a product, and the rest of the market wants to treat it often as a component. And that's, I think, the real distinction there, and Docker is increasingly, making the efforts to differentiate its product in an open source community. And that, I think, is the challenge that it faces as, with its business model. How do they provide that continued innovation around their Docker platform while also maintaining, it as a component that is available, the open source community can rely on? So
we've seen these larger companies get involved in Docker. Google, Huawei, RedHat, there's others. So are these companies just using Docker, or are they influencing the direction of the software itself? Do companies like Google and Huawei and RedHat, do they have governance influence on the direction that Docker goes?
Well, I know that actually RedHat is one of Docker's largest contributors. As far as governance goes, I also know that that Red Hat has voiced frustration at times at not being able to get all their patches in upstream as well. So, yes and no.
I think that's where these organizations start to play a role, right? So, where you start to see the significance of the Open Container Initiative, for example, and the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And that's where the governance, I think, mostly resides. Otherwise, with these company-driven open source projects, it's really the company that's really managing it.
That's part of the fight that's going on now, actually, is, who should ultimately control the code base? Should it be Docker, which wants to add features as quickly as possible, or should it be OCI, which wants to standardize everything and just leave at least a common base that all companies, not only Docker, but other companies in the Docker ecosystem can build from?
Indeed. So let's get to this story about the Docker fork rumors. When did you first start hearing about a Docker fork?
The discussions about a Docker fork have actually been going on for quite a while. And I remember first hearing about it, from just technologists who were curious, following DockerCon about the announcements there and what does it mean with Docker Swarm integrated directly into Docker Engine. And for those who are not familiar, Docker Swarm is the orchestration platform developed by Docker. It competes directly with Kubernetes, and Docker Swarm, by being integrated into the Docker engine, created then some real issues, I think, for the community, because now that it was baked in, what were the choices that that the developer would have, and what would that mean for the general, the larger ecosystem?
Even before that, there had been growing voices about Docker's rapid release schedule and the adding in of new features, particularly the new features that weren't fully baked in yet. And so there were grumblings here and there about that, especially from partners who would have to implement these things on behalf of their customers. But it was the inclusion of Docker Swarm that really, I think, pushed things into open conversation.
Yeah. So it should be noted that the Docker orchestration capabilities are opt-in, and they must be activated by the user. But the concern is that by many is that by not opting in, it may lead to backward compatibility issues down the road. So that then surfaced discussions about long-term support and what would Docker's long-term support be. And I don't think Docker's been real clear about that. I think what they cite is, you can subscribe to Docker Data Center, and by doing that, then you get the longer-term support. But in terms of the open source community, there were concerns about Docker breaking on them, and issues about deprecation. And these are the types of problems that were becoming part of the overall dynamic here. Now, it must be noted that there's a lot of there's a lot of economic interest in this because of the significance that it has. Technology stacks are changing dramatically, and we've gone through this era of virtualization, and virtualization became the standard inside open data centers. But the difference really emerged with, I think you can argue, AWS and this ability to use compute in a manner that you could not do before. Whereas in the world of the the enterprise data center, it was mostly just about the limitations that you have. Now there's really not those limitations really at all. I was actually listening to what is it? I forget the name of the podcast. So I'm gonna
Cloudcast, I bet.
Cloudcast, yes.
I knew it. I'm psychic.
Yeah,
that show's great, by the way. I need to get those guys on this show. That show's fantastic.
Yeah, they're great guys, and they had Keith on. And I can't remember Keith's last name. Do you know he's a VMware? Not evangelist, but he really understands the VMware community, and there were discussions that the CIO at VMware was very open that VMware developers are using AWS, and so this is significant, and so this is really what's at stake here. There's billions of dollars at stake here.
VMware does have a competing product, right, to AWS?
I mean, it's like, containers in a VM on top of a hamburger. I don't know. I mean, it's like
it's like a federation of service providers all using an interoperable vSphere backplane, I guess you would call it, from my understanding.
So then you have these economic interests at play, and here comes Google, and Google really hasn't made much of a play in the cloud market whatsoever over the past several years. It's been dominated by AWS. Azure has is easily the second in the market, and they said, wait a second, we've been using containers for years. This is our world. I really think that they see this as really kind of an opportunity to make a real commercial play, in the cloud services community. Because if you look at Kubernetes and you look at how it's integrating, it's really fitting in, trying to fit in all the pieces, to make Kubernetes work, very seamlessly with Google Compute.
Yes,
with
indeed.
GCE, Google Compute Engine.
Indeed, and this is what to me seems like is at the heart of this fork discussion. I think it seems fundamentally to me about the idea that the money is in who is vending the compute, and Google is going to win that battle against Docker any day. And when you look at the Docker, I mean, as I understand the push to bake in support for Swarm, it to me seems like a grab at the orchestration that Kubernetes would otherwise be doing. Now, the alternative way of looking at it is perhaps there's no one-size-fits-all orchestration, and just like in frameworks, some people are going to use Ruby on Rails, some people are going to use Spring. There's no one-size-fits-all, and there's going to you can have all kinds of things. Maybe it's great. Maybe everybody's going to need an orchestration layer, and you might as well have one that's convenience, where you can just kind of say, okay, easily get my Docker Swarm up and running, migrate to Kubernetes later on if I want to. I don't know. I can see different ways of looking at this, baking in Swarm support. So, I think one way of framing this, there's a quote from Bob Wise in your article about the Docker fork, which is where this podcast is based on, by the way. Anybody who hasn't seen this Docker fork article should go and read it immediately. It's a great read. There's a quote from Bob Wise, who works at Samsung. Samsung recently acquired Joyent. And the quote is, "If your team is working deeply in Kubernetes or Mesos or Cloud Foundry, you need a stable, simple, boring container implementation with minimal essential characteristics." And this is obviously in contrast to the fast-moving idea of Docker. Why do people need simplicity today?
Well, and this really does get to the I guess the heart of the matter. The enterprise, the data center needs simplicity at the container level, because they need to be able to not only build on top of it, but also maintain it for 5-10 years down the road. When you're architecting these systems, you have to architect them for long-term continual use. You can't keep going back and changing around the API, because at that point you have too many containers that are reliant, and you just have too many edge cases. And this kind of gets to, from my perspective, it kind of gets to the heart of the matter. Is there had been containers before Docker, but Docker appealed to the developers in a way that none of the other offerings had, for a variety of reasons. One of which is it made it completely seamless to run, build an application and then move it off to a server and then not have to worry about deployment issues. So Docker was an easy sell for developers. For the operations community, for the system administrators out there, that's anything but a given. They don't, what is this container thing? We had this before. You'll hear a lot of those type of arguments. And so one of the interesting things we saw was the week after Docker made the announcement of Docker Swarm, Red Hat had its Red Hat Summit, and it was interesting to see the contrast between the two, and it felt as if Red Hat was responding to the Docker Swarm by saying, no, OpenShift being the commercial version of Kubernetes that Red Hat itself supports. And Red Hat was saying, yeah, OpenShift can provide you everything you need. And that was the first time we started hearing talk from Red Hat about, maybe we don't actually need the Docker engine if you have everything else in place. So in answer to your question, it goes back to, it's the OSI seven layer model of networking. Every layer must be cleanly defined so other layers can build on top of it. And to a certain extent, it's also about commoditization as well. You want the other company to commoditize its product so you could build value add on top of that. But you don't want to commoditize your own product because that pretty much gives away the market. And that's where Docker is now. And to a certain extent, when Red Hat and also when Google, they're fighting for a more commoditized container, then they're doing it because they want operations to run as smoothly as possible with as little interruption as possible. Whereas when Docker wants to, they've been more than willing to to open source or to standardize on a lot of their platform, but they're holding back a little bit just to add in the new features and to keep continuing to innovate aggressively. And that is, I think, a certain sore point. So Docker has to make the choice that, do they want to go towards VMware and just kind of lock down the market, or do they want to keep things totally open and then compete against, to be frank, a lot of larger and better equipped competitors at this point.
I think also, the technologists will tell you that infrastructure should be boring, and that makes perfect sense. That infrastructure should be boring. You want your plumbing to be boring, right? You don't want your plumbing to be very, very exciting. You want your plumbing just to work. But it's taken a long time for plumbing to actually work. And it's taken a long time for infrastructure to work that makes cities run. If you look at, for example, New York City, some of the original kind of systems for, some of the original kind of plumbing systems, they use hollow logs to move water around for drinking. Well, then the logs started to rot and people started to get sick. So they had to figure that out. And I think that's kind of the paradox right now where, infrastructure should be boring, but it's going through a lot of changes right now. So it's not going to be boring really for a while, because now the applications are really becoming the center of the universe. And if you look at AWS infrastructure, it's really not built for container environments. They have a container service, but the real opportunity, that I would expect is that companies, the big companies, they're going to want to sell compute because compute actually does sell, and the networking and storage should go with it. And if you have that compute that you can sell, any of the networking storage, and if it's more application centric, that leads to the questions about, well, what kind of infrastructure should I develop? Should it be container based? And I would argue that that makes sense. And from the people I talk to, that's the direction. And that again speaks to the incredible importance of what we're witnessing right now. We're looking at the next generation of technology development, and it's being defined right now as we speak.
Continuous integration is so useful that I've started using it on my own personal projects. SnapCI from ThoughtWorks has the fastest setup I've ever seen. I registered for SnapCI with my GitHub account, and after a few clicks, I had continuous integration pipelines set up for a Node.js application and a Rails application that were just sitting on my GitHub account. And I don't want my users to experience breaking changes, so I want to run a large suite of tests for my application every time I push a change. And SnapCI will run those tests quickly, in parallel, on a worker that SnapCI spins up and takes care of for me. Whether you have personal projects like me, or you work at a company that is looking for the perfect tool to improve the deployment process, go to snap.ci/softwareengineeringdaily. SnapCI embodies the lessons that ThoughtWorks has learned from 20 years of software deployment, the same lessons that have been written about by Martin Fowler and Jez Humble. Check it out at snap.ci/softwareengineeringdaily. It would support Software Engineering Daily, and you would get to check out continuous deployment. snap.ci/softwareengineeringdaily. Thanks for listening. I was talking this morning to Sinclair Schuller from Apprenda, who is the CEO of Apprenda, and we were just talking about how we both had empathy for Docker because Docker kicked off this whole container revolution, this container virality, but the business model for Docker, the straightforward business model, there doesn't seem to be a straightforward business model. So, I think this is epitomized by the fact that this is a $1 billion valuation company, and we have trouble we don't know what the business model is. We don't know what the business model that they're striving towards. I mean, that's not necessarily a terrible sign. Like, who knows what Magic Leap's business model is? But I think another way that Docker might potentially be undercut is, I mean, if we talk about Kubernetes, Kubernetes right now, you need to use Docker containers on Kubernetes, but this is not necessarily going to be the case in the future. Maybe, and if the OCI gains popularity, or if it becomes easier to support, or if Docker stabilizes its compliance with OCI somehow, then maybe we'll just be running OCI compliant containers on Kubernetes. So I just say that to preface the discussion of this Twitter dispute between Kelsey Hightower of Kubernetes and Solomon Hykes of Docker. There was this Twitter dispute that was pretty acrimonious regarding the OCI. This dispute was eventually resolved, but it was pretty worrying to see this dialogue. If you're anybody in the community that's hoping for stabilization anytime soon, why don't you explain what the OCI is and what happened in this discussion between Kelsey and Solomon?
Oh, yes. Excellent. Let me call up. We actually did a story on that. Let me call up the notes on that. But in general, I can't remember how the actual debate had started. Oh, it was Kelsey was looking around for alternative container engines to Docker. Is that correct, Alex? And Solomon had said, no, you're not going to find one. Only the Docker engines provides 100% support. And Kelsey had said, well, that's kind of problematic if you're trying to build an open source community. And from there, the debate had gone on about to what extent OCI was providing an actual standard, not only for the runtime, but also for the image itself, in terms of how much fidelity that companies could trust in, that this was something that would be worth banking on, in essence. But at one point, Solomon had derived the OCI image standard as a fake standard. He didn't feel that it was it represented the entire image and its capabilities, the Docker image and its capabilities. The OCI was originally created with Docker's blessing. In fact, Docker had bequeathed quite a bit of the code over to OCI, including the runtime, what would become Run C, to use as a standard. But at the same time, Solomon was also saying, well, you'll get 90% of the way there of like Run C, but we're always going to have something in addition to this. I'm sure it's been a couple months since this exchange took place, and I'll send you the link for the story, but those basically the gist of it. Now, what is interesting is something that happened today, actually. Near the end of September, is RedHat announced a project called the Oci Daemon, which was to do exactly what you're talking about, and to kind of allow Kubernetes to run containers that run other containers other than Docker's own, and that was a first step in moving away from the Docker container format.
To me, this is the heart of what's happening right now. And if you look at OCI and its history, at DockerCon, I think 2015, Solomon, announced OCI. It was called OCF. And it was really good to develop a standard image format and runtime. And that seemed like a necessary thing to do. And I think looking back at it, again, it shows that Docker, for the community, they view it as a component. They want that stability. They want that standard image format and runtime. And Docker, they listened and they said, okay, we'll do that. But that then allowed the market, the players in the market, especially the RedHats and the Googles, to really start to focus on developing the standard image format and runtime. And the question at the time then became, how is Docker going to differentiate itself? How are they going to be actual product? If in reality, the Docker open source technology is really a component. And so that's, I think, where, the tensions really were there even before the OCI became something. And I think that's kind of what we saw in this dispute between Kelsey Hightower and Solomon Hykes. And I don't even know what's called a dispute, but more of a debate. And really the debate centered on how much Docker should donate of its container technology to the OCI to build a vendor-neutral container image and runtime specification, reading directly from the post that Joe did. And so that's I think a big part of this. Again, the product and the component.
Now, to be fair, that Solomon in this exchange had said that once the innovation slows down, then Docker's more than happy to hand it off for standardization. But his argument is things are still too new. We still got the, as you said, Alex, the logs for plumbing, and it's still too early to hand off for standardization. But Google, evidently, as well as RedHat, were saying, no, it's ready. You need to cut this over and, let us make money off of building larger systems around it.
I think it's also, I think it's also important to note that Docker has, I think, $150 million in funding, and they're sitting on a big chest, and they can sit back a bit. And actually, we published a story just earlier this week or late last week about Docker Swarm, and Docker Swarm actually, according to some, is actually doing pretty well, and people are using it. And, there may be an opportunity for Docker to build that Docker stack.
Yeah, in fact, to date, it's who has the Docker mindshare? It's Docker. Kubernetes, I think Donnie Burkholz at 451 had shown, he did some research that shown that Kubernetes is starting to take off in production cases. So there is a little bit of movement there, but it's still Docker's market to lose, or not to lose.
Well, and then I guess if the ease of use from Docker Swarm, this is kind of like going back to what I was saying, like there's the tension between the ease of use platform and then maybe perhaps the platform that might be the better use case long term, which I don't know, may or may not be Kubernetes. I guess they're just different. And
I think this is what you're getting at here. It gets to the heart of it, because I really love the Docker philosophy, and in the Docker philosophy, and I think it was said well by one of their evangelists, Shanazon. I don't know if I can't remember his first name, but he talked about there's billions of people who are now using the internet, and there are millions of developers now programming to the internet, and that means that we're just getting started, because there's so much more to the internet than we know of it today. And so that's going to require deeper abstractions for how you actually develop applications on an internet that might stretch well beyond just the computer that you're looking at today. And so that's going to require new tools and new abilities, for developers who may not necessarily have that computer science degree, or maybe not necessarily even know multiple programming languages.
Yeah, or even if you do know those things, perhaps you don't care and you just want to get the thing up and running quickly.
And that's a core. And that's and for Docker, that's one of the things that they're really thinking about. The ability to program the internet.
Right, and this gets at one of the themes on Software Engineering Daily that has been a hard lesson for me to learn, but I have learned it over time, is the idea of picking winners and having this framing of one size fits all, or MongoDB or Cassandra or Spark or Storm. Who's the winner? Kubernetes or Mesos? It's almost always the wrong framing to be looking at these technologies, because there are always multiple winners. They're always shifting, and there are always trade-offs between the different platforms. Is it going to be AWS or Google or Azure? It's everybody, probably in the long run. But I digress. So, how might this fork actually look? I mean, what if this fork were to happen? What would actually happen? How might the fork differ from the current Docker?
Well, there you go. That's the big question. I think there's different thinking on this. First of all, right, forks happen all the time, right? Like companies, if they're using open source technology, they may have to fork it themselves just to be able to service their customers, right? So coding forks, the forks around the code are not so unusual. What's unusual is when the community decides we're going to change this. And this is where you get into issues about the governance itself, who owns a trademark, all these different factors that play into it. So there's, in an extreme case, a faction of the community would say we're going to develop our own contained image format and runtime, or we're going to call it we're going to call it C change, or whatever you want to call it, right? And that would then require it to be managed independently, and with its own trademark. And then what is that technology going to be? No one has really been building out kind of an alternative to it, except maybe the Rocket from CoreOS. So then the question becomes, well, what is the role of OCI in all this? And could there be a long-term stable, fork, so to speak, that comes from within OCI? And I think that's what we saw today in some respects. It's a hint of that, right? Where the story today really is about this effort on behalf of really being initiated, I think, primarily by Red Hat and Google engineers who are working on a way for Kubernetes to run containers without Docker. And so that means then that, Docker, in some respects, at least in this, in this context, is marginalized. So they can have something that allows Kubernetes to launch containers at scale without having to worry about the stability of Docker itself. Also, provides another market advantage for a company like Red Hat and for companies like Red Hat and Google and their allies.
So, I mean, if a fork happened, where would that leave Docker? What would Docker be doing under those circumstances?
It depends largely on its customer base and what its customer base is looking for primarily. A big concern in general with these sorts of things is a vendor lock-in. And I know enterprises and other industrial buyers of IT, they worry about being locked in to some extent, though, to the extent they also have to compete. They also have to weigh that against the fact that they need solutions that work for them. Unlike Google or Twitter, a lot of organizations can't hire open source gurus to maintain these things. It's not it's not even a case of them paying them enough. It's just there's not enough out there, and these developers would tend to gravitate towards the Facebooks and the Googles anyway. So, a big chunk of the IT buying dollar is going to require packaged solutions where you do all the heavy lifting, where a company such as Docker does all the heavy lifting. So in one scenario, Docker could be like VMware did a few years ago, and they did some open standard work, but largely VMware captured a nice chunk of the enterprise market and still profits from that. And there's not a lot of open source going on there. That's one possible route. But if the customers start to feel, start to feel uncomfortable with the licensing terms or the support models that Docker's offering, then there might be an initiative to move to competing offerings, which would be easy to spin up, given that at least 90% of all this is already standardized. So it could go either way for Docker. It depends on, how they work with their customer base.
This gets into also much larger issues. This now gets into the real strategic direction for Docker, its investors, its role in the open source community. How it will merge from that, I think, is the big question. What kind of shifts will this cause for Docker and itself, or none at all? I think that's what we're waiting for.
Has the CNCF weighed in on their thoughts about the Docker fork?
Not really. No. I mean, it's not as far as we can tell. I mean, I think they're very much aligned with Kubernetes, and so that's kind of a key factor here. And Docker's a member of CNCF, but Docker's really not active in CNCF. They're definitely, I think, they're definitely a key kind of player in all this. They're really focusing on, CNCF is focusing on, developing these core technologies for programmable infrastructure, really. And so you're seeing them, adopt things like Prometheus, the monitoring environment. And I think I think they've announced some others too. And, isn't that right, Job?
No, I think Prometheus.
Prometheus is the only one so far?
Yeah, they have a whole list of other potential technologies they may take on, like etcd and FluentD, but nothing's been signed yet.
So it's September 22nd today. I think this article about your first article about the Docker fork, which trended pretty virally, I think that was published a month and a half or 2 months ago or so. What has changed since then? What is the evolving conversation around the Docker fork since you published that article? Has it heated up? Has it cooled down? What have been the evolutions of that conversation?
It's cooled down a little bit, but something very interesting. I think right about that time, people in the industry started talking more openly about the dissatisfactions with Docker. Up until then, there were grumblings, but they tended to be kind of completely off the record, or entrusting with people, that sort of thing. But dissatisfactions with Docker really came out more in the open. It's been about a month since the article was published. And one of the interesting things that you could, in the talks and in the blog posts, there's always something that I kind of refer to as the Docker clause, which about a sentence or two into whatever dissatisfaction that someone has with Docker, they will point out that Docker did a great job, building this technology and getting developers on board, and then the dissatisfaction would continue. But you'll find that in a lot of dissatisfaction. But there was a lot of airing of grievances that happened right about that time.
I think, one of the interesting results of that too is just, I think, for me, is a deeper interest in how open source communities work and how they're managed and how they're structured. And I think this surfaces a lot of those types of issues And I think there's more interest in open source than ever before on the behalf of organizations who are trying to build out, applications at scale. And if you're going to build out applications at scale, you need to adopt open source technologies. And with that goes a lot of education into the culture of these organizations and how they operate. And that's one of, I think, the interesting kind of results of this is, companies are asking more questions. They're like, how does this stuff work? How do you...
I totally agree with that. I think it's a very unique political situation. You think about... my impression is that there were stuff around, in Hortonworks and Cloudera were in the throes of battle trying to figure out who was going to win more of the Hadoop market. I think there was some of this kind of jostling going around, but my sense is, or even like the Node.js fork a while ago, but my sense is that none of that really compares to kind of the stakes of this Docker potential fork, and it makes for quite an interesting situation.
It does.
Great. All right. Well, Alex and Joab, thanks for coming on the show. I have really enjoyed talking to you. I love the new stack, and I will continue paying attention. Anybody who is a podcast fan who's listening to this, and if you have not checked out the new stack, they have, I think, 3 podcasts: New Stack Analysts, New Stack Makers, and what's the third one?
We have the New Stack at Scale.
New Stack at Scale.
New Stack Makers, New Stack Analysts, and Context is a new show. And I would just like to say, Jeff, you're doing a fantastic job with your podcast, and your preparation and your professionalism and just the overall quality of your shows is excellent. And we hats off to you for all the work that you've done here.
Appreciate it. All right, well, great to talk to you guys. I'll keep in touch.
All right, thank you.
Great, thanks.
New Relic is partnering with MLB for the Bases Coded Technology Challenge. Small teams will have the opportunity to hack at the convergence of sports and technology while utilizing proprietary APIs and private data provided by MLB. The finalist teams will be flown to the World Series for an overnight software development competition. Check out more details at basescoded.com.